The ledger speaks. Close your eyes and picture a medieval castle. You probably see gray stone towers rising against a stormy sky, archers on battlements, knights in armor. You hear the clash of swords, the thunder of hooves. But there's another sound you're missing, the scratch of a quill on parchment, the quiet clink of coins being counted, the rustle of receipts and rolls. Because behind every imposing fortress, behind every curtain wall and keep, there was something most people never think about, a mountain of paperwork, an ocean of expenses, a never-ending flow of money, materials, and human labor. This isn't a story about battles. It's a story about bills, about the hidden machinery that made medieval power possible, about how coins and contracts built the stones that shaped history. Welcome to the economics of medieval castles. Part 1. What a castle actually was. The castle as financial hub. When medieval documents refer to a castle with its appurtenances, they're not just talking about walls. They're describing a complete economic system. The word appurtenances is doing heavy lifting here. It means all the revenue-generating assets attached to the fortress. Think of it like this. A castle wasn't just a building. It was a bundle of income streams wrapped in stone. The domain lands that produced grain and livestock. The mills where tenants were forced to grind their wheat, paying a toll for the privilege. The weekly markets where stallholders paid fees. The fish ponds stocked with carp and pike. The deer parks that provided both meat and status symbols. The bridge where travelers paid tolls. The forest where timber could be harvested and sold. All of these generated money, and all of them were controlled from the castle, recorded in the castle's accounts, enforced by the castle's courts. The caput, the head of power. Medieval Latin called the castle a caput, a head. It was where authority concentrated. The sheriff held shire court in the hall. The Lord Steward presided over the honorial court under the roof. Fines were paid there. Rents were counted there. Grain rendered from tenancies was weighed and recorded there. Whoever held the keys often held the ledgers, and whoever held the ledgers could shape the entire local economy, summon labor for road repairs, assign cart duty, delay a payment to pressure a debtor, forgive an arrear to win loyalty, reward a faithful reeve with a better assignment. The fortress and the filing system lived together. You couldn't have one without the other. Architecture makes economics visible. Walk into a great medieval hall and look around. The layout itself is an economic diagram. The raised dais at one end is where the Lord sits, elevated above everyone else. That's not just ceremony. It's a visual reminder of who pays whom. The timber screens at the other end channel servants bringing food from the kitchens. The long tables in between are arranged by rank, and rank determines who owes what to whom. Behind the hall, kitchens swallowing cartloads of firewood, brewhouses turning grain into ale, bakeries producing hundreds of loaves, the buttery storing beer and wine, the pantry holding bread and cheese, the larders and cellars, each one both a storage space and an accounting node. A household of any size consumes predictably. That predictability is power. Local tenants know what the castle will need next month and next season. They plant accordingly, they cart accordingly, they live by the castle's rhythm. The iterative nature of medieval government. Here's something that surprises modern people. Medieval government moved. Kings and great lords traveled constantly between their castles. Where they could be received in comfort and ceremony, government happened. That meant records, revenues, and meals on the move. Castles along a royal itinerary became storage depots for the state, treasuries for coin and silver plate, muniment rooms for charters and parchment rolls, arsenals for bows, crossbows, and armor, magazines for saltfish and grain. When a royal visit was expected, expenses spiked. Roofs were hurriedly repaired. Rushes were renewed in chambers. Wine was ordered by the ton. That's 252 gallons, enough to fill 1,344 modern wine bottles. Candles and tapers were purchased in quantity. Hospitality was policy, and policy cost money. Part 2. The Money Pipeline. Where did the cash come from? Let's trace the flow of silver into a castle's coffers. In the English system, much came from local revenues. The sheriff was told to fund castle works from the issues of the county, meaning he collected taxes, rents, and court fees from the shire and spent some on the fortress. Where a castle sat inside a confiscated lordship or on lands held in royal wardship, its own revenues took the first hit. Only when that money ran out did the burden fall on the wider shire. The Exchequer, England's financial bureaucracy, audited these expenses annually through documents called pipe rolls. These rolls recorded terse entries, and for the works of the Castle of X, so many pounds. Behind those lines were months of quarrying, lime burning, carpentry, cartage, and wages. But not everything appeared in the pipe rolls. Some repairs ran through the royal household's wardrobe accounts, an alternative funding channel that allowed for speed and secrecy. The pattern was clear, though. Royal castles were local economic engines funded by local taxes, topped up by central money when crises hit or when a king chose magnificence over thrift. The pipe rolls, medieval spreadsheets. The pipe rolls deserve their own spotlight. Starting in 1130 and running almost continuously until 1832, they're the oldest series of English public records. Their name comes from their appearance when rolled up and stored. They looked like stacks of pipes. Made from sheepskin parchment, sewn together and written on both sides, they recorded the annual accounts of sheriffs. These were the chief financial officers for individual counties, and they had to answer for every penny collected and spent. Royal income from feudal dues, judicial fees, market tolls, and other sources was balanced against the expenses of the crown's officers. This gave the Exchequer a basis for calculating the king's actual revenue. As new accounting offices were set up to handle specialized revenues, the Exchequer accounts diminished somewhat in importance, but they remained the backbone of royal finance. Reading through pipe rolls today, and many have been published by the Pipe Roll Society, you see the medieval state thinking in numbers. You see which castles ate the most money. You see which sheriffs were efficient and which were constantly in arrears. You see the rhythm of construction seasons, heavy spending in spring and autumn, lighter work in high summer and deep winter. The cost of doing nothing. If building a castle was dramatic, maintenance was the quiet cost that never stopped. People notice when a king commissions a massive fortress. They don't notice when someone repoints mortar or replaces lead on a roof. But that boring maintenance was what kept a fortress functional. Roofs shed their lead sheeting. Lime mortar weathered and crumbled. Timber rotted where it met wet stone. Drains choked with leaves and mud. The cheapest castle, in the long run, was the one you kept dry. Water was the enemy of walls. It seeped into cracks, froze in winter, expanded, and blew apart stonework. That's why the most common orders in accounts are aggressively dull. Re-lead the hall roof, repoint the arch of the gatehouse, fit iron dogs to the bridge timbers, mend the sluice of the fish pond, clean the well, clear the culvert. This wasn't glory. This was institutional housekeeping. But a castle that skimmed on gutters would pay for it later with collapsed vaults and crumbling curtain walls. War changes everything. In peacetime, a castle could coast on a skeleton crew, a constable, a clerk, a handful of men-at-arms, a porter, a chaplain, maybe a carpenter on retainer. Then war arrived, and the payroll exploded. Knights and surgeons, mounted and on foot, archers with longbows, crossbowmen with their heavier, slower, more expensive weapons, engineers who understood siegecraft and mining, armorers and smiths to maintain equipment, farriers for horses, carters and boatmen to move supplies. Horses needed fodder, soldiers needed grain, ale, salt meat, cheese, and bread. All of this had to be purchased in bulk and moved over poor roads or along rivers. A single season of siege warfare could consume more money than years of careful peacetime maintenance. And if the castle fell and was slighted, deliberately damaged to prevent its future use, that cost money too. Unmaking what money made was itself an expensive business. Part 3. What it cost to build. The workforce behind the stone. Let's talk numbers. By 1304, Edward I of England had spent at least £80,000 on his Welsh castle building program. To understand that figure, consider that Edward's annual royal income was around £13,000 to £20,000. He spent roughly 4 to 6 times his yearly revenue on these fortifications. In today's money, estimates vary, but scholars suggest £80,000 in the late 13th century equates to somewhere between 56 million and 100 million in modern pounds. But that kind of conversion is misleading because the relative cost of labor versus materials was so different. Let's zoom in on one project, Bia Maris Castle on Egglesey. Begun in 1295, work continued until 1330 when funding finally dried up. By then, £15,000 had been spent, and the castle was still incomplete. Only Carnarvon, at £20,000 to £25,000, cost more. Harlech came in at a relatively modest £8,000. To put Beaumaris in perspective, the English Treasury's total annual income was less than £20,000 at the time. A single castle represented 3/4 of a year's revenue for the entire realm. Who did the work? In the summer of 1286, at Harlech Castle, the payroll included 546 general laborers, 115 quarrymen, 30 blacksmiths, 22 carpenters, and 227 stonemasons, all working simultaneously. That's 940 people on one site, and that's just one castle in Edward's ring of fortifications. The workforce was organized hierarchically. At the top was a master mason, a designer, engineer, and supervisor rolled into one. The most famous was Master James of St. George, imported from Savoy in modern-day France-Italy border region. Edward paid him 3 shillings a day, an enormous sum when a common laborer earned 1 shilling per week. Below the master mason came specialized stonemasons who cut and laid ashlar, the fine-dressed stone used for corners and door frames. Then rough masons who worked with rubble and mortar. Carpenters built scaffolding, centering for arches, and the timber roofs. Quarrymen extracted stone. Lime burners operated kilns that consumed vast amounts of firewood. Smiths forged tools and hardware. Carters moved materials. Hodmen carried lime and mortar. And at the bottom, hundreds of unskilled laborers hauled, dug, and fetched. Labor costs dominated. Medieval building accounts regularly showed 2 coins out of 3 going to people rather than materials. Stone was heavy, but relatively cheap once you found a good quarry. The expensive part was shaping it. A master mason might be paid by the day, by the piece, or on contract. Day rates gave him steady income, but no incentive to rush. Piece rates, paid per vault rib or per course of ashlar, rewarded speed but required careful quality checking. Contracts for whole sections of work, with bonuses for finishing by a certain feast day, split the risk between lord and craftsman. A skilled mason might earn 4 to 6 pence per day. A carpenter earned similar wages. A common laborer earned 1 to 2 pence. That might not sound like much, but remember, a pound sterling was 240 pence. Hiring 500 laborers for a week at 1.5 pence per day meant a bill of £31, 5 shillings, and that's just the unskilled workforce. Seasonal rhythms. Labor supply swung with the agricultural calendar. After harvest, more hands were available at better rates. During haymaking and grain harvest in high summer, labor was scarce and expensive. Smart constables planned accordingly. Heavy construction in autumn and spring, maintenance and indoor work in winter and summer. Carters were often the bottleneck. Moving stone over land was slow and expensive. A cartload might travel only 10 or 15 miles in a day on medieval roads. Cost per mile added up fast. Rivers and coasts, on the other hand, were bargains. Timber floated. Stone could ride barges. Grain moved by boat rather than by pack horse or ox cart. That's why so many great castles sit on navigable water. Dover, overlooking the Channel. Conway at the mouth of its river. Carnarvon on the Menai Strait. Water was a logistical subsidy. Materials: stone, lime, timber, iron, lead. Stone was quarried locally whenever possible. Good building stone was limestone or sandstone, relatively easy to cut when fresh from the quarry, hardening with exposure to air. Granite was harder to work and usually avoided except where nothing else was available. Transport was the killer. A rule of thumb, if you had to cart stone more than 20 miles, the cost of transport could exceed the cost of the stone itself. Castles with nearby quarries had an enormous advantage. Lime mortar required limestone burned in kilns. The process was fuel-intensive. It took cords and cords of wood to produce enough quicklime for a major building project. In heavily forested regions, this was manageable. In treeless areas, it was a nightmare. Timber was needed for scaffolding, centering, the wooden frameworks that held up arches while mortar set, roofing, floors, doors, and interior partitions. Oak was preferred for its strength and durability. In England, royal forests provided some timber, but much had to be purchased from private landowners or imported. Iron came as bar stock from forges and was worked by blacksmiths into nails, hinges, straps, door furniture, window grills, and portcullis teeth. A castle might consume iron by the hundredweight, 112 pounds at a time. Lead was expensive but essential for roofing. It was waterproof, long-lasting, and could be melted down and recast when repairs were needed. Lead sheeting was measured by count and weight, and old lead was credited back when new sheets were installed. Speed versus cost. Edward I's Welsh castles were built fast by medieval standards. Most were begun in 1283 and substantially complete by 1295. That's just 12 years for the core structures. Compare that to cathedrals, which could take a century or more. Why the speed? Because Edward needed them operational. He was colonizing hostile territory and couldn't afford to wait. But speed is expensive. Hiring many hands at once strains the local labor market. Tools wear out faster. Carts break more often. Scaffolds rise and fall in a heartbeat. You pay a premium for urgency. Yet speed has strategic value. A fortress that appears swiftly changes the political weather. A rival delays. A town submits. A frontier settles. What's the cost of a war not fought? Part 4. Castles as economic engines. Markets and towns. Many Edwardian castles came with planned towns. Edward didn't just build fortresses. He built boroughs against their walls and gave those boroughs charters. Burgesses got plots and privileges, free tenure, freedom from certain feudal dues, the right to hold markets. In return, they paid rents and taxes. The urban tax base became part of the castle's diet. You can still see the plan on the ground at places like Conway. A polygonal castle on a rocky promontory enclosed within its own curtain wall. Below, a walled grid of streets, a quay where barges unloaded timber and stone, a bridge where tolls rang like a bell every market day. The total spend was immense, but it wasn't just spending. It was investment. These towns threw off income for centuries. Customs on goods, stallage fees for market stalls, quay dues for using the dock, fines from borough courts, and the steady trickle of rent. Banal rights, the economics of monopoly. Banal comes from the French bon, meaning the lord's legal authority. Banal rights were the lord's monopolies, and they were money machines. The banal mill. Tenants were required to grind their grain at the lord's mill and pay a toll, typically a fraction of the flour produced. Hand grinding at home was forbidden. The lord's miller kept the wheel turning, the mill race clear, and the stones dressed. The revenue was steady and predictable. Banal ovens. In some regions, peasants had to bake their bread in the lord's oven for a fee. This was less common than the mill, but still profitable where enforced. Banal wine presses. In wine-producing areas, grapes had to be pressed at the lord's press. These monopolies were deeply resented, but also deeply embedded in the economic structure. The lord's capital investment, the mill, the press, the oven, was repaid through compulsory fees. Tenants grumbled, but they paid. Tolls, pontage, and customs. Wherever goods moved, there was an opportunity to charge. Bridges collected pontage. Ferries charged passage fees. Market stalls paid stallage. Goods weighed at official scales paid fees. Merchants entering a town's gates paid customs. Castles that controlled choke points, narrow river crossings, mountain passes, tidal harbors, could extract wealth just by sitting there. The classic example is the Rhine toll castles, fortresses perched on islands or narrows where the river couldn't be avoided. Chain booms stretched across the water. Every barge stopped, every cargo was assessed, every merchant paid. In the Baltic, the Teutonic Order's brick castles controlled river and sea trade. Grain and timber floated past their walls, tolls filled their coffers. On the coasts of Wales and Ireland, tower houses watched fish weirs and tidal inlets. The honors men lifted wicker traps, recorded the catch, and taxed a portion. Distance and geography wrote the rate schedules. A merchant who could bypass a toll castle would. A merchant who couldn't would negotiate, pay, and pass, grudgingly but reliably. Fish ponds and parks, status and sustenance. Fish ponds were both pantry and prestige. Carp, pike, tench, and bream were stocked in managed ponds near the castle. On fast days, Fridays, Wednesdays during Lent, vigils of major feasts, meat was forbidden. Fish filled the gop. A well-maintained fish pond provided fresh protein year-round, but it was also a display of wealth and control. Creating and stocking a fish pond took capital and labor. It said, "I have resources to spare." Deer parks served a similar dual purpose. Venison for the table, yes, but also a stage for hunting, that most aristocratic of pastimes. A park required walls or paling, gamekeepers controlled breeding. It was expensive. That was the point. The park wasn't just about deer. It was about demonstrating that you could afford to set aside productive land for pleasure. The household economy, feeding the castle. Let's talk about consumption. A garrison of 100 people, plus a lord's household of another 50, plus visiting knights and their retinues, could easily mean feeding 200 mouths daily. Each adult needed roughly 1 to 1.5 kilograms of bread per day. That's 200 to 300 kilograms of bread daily, requiring over a ton of grain per week. Multiply by 50 weeks, accounting for Lent and other lean times, and you need 50 to 75 tons of grain annually just for bread. Add ale. The average medieval person drank a gallon of ale per day, not because they were drunk all the time, but because ale was safer than water and provided calories. A gallon per person per day for 200 people is 200 gallons daily, or about 73,000 gallons per year. Brewing that much ale required malt, sprouted and dried grain, water, and fuel for boiling. A brew house was a factory that ran constantly. Then came meat. In Lent and on fast days, fish replaced meat. For the rest of the year, salted pork, beef, mutton, and game supplemented fresh meat when available. Cheese, butter, eggs, peas, beans, onions, root vegetables, and seasonings rounded out the diet. All of this had to be sourced, transported, stored, inventoried, and rotated to prevent spoilage. Failure meant hunger. Hunger meant mutiny. Provisioning for siege. Preparing for a siege was an exercise in calculation. How long could the castle endure without resupply? 3 months? 6? A year? Grain was the foundation. Wheat and barley stored well if kept dry. Grain dins were aired regularly. Rats and mice were the enemy. Cats were valued workers. Salt was precious. It preserved meat and fish. Without salt, proteins rotted within days. A castle under threat stockpiled salt by the barrel. Water mattered more than food. Cisterns, wells, and springs determined survival. A castle with unreliable water was a castle that would fall. That's why besiegers often tried to poison or block water sources, and why castle builders obsessed over hydrology. In the Crusader states, fortresses like Crac de Chevalier were designed as much around water storage as around walls. Their massive cisterns could sustain garrisons for months. Wages and rations. Soldiers and workers were paid partly in coin, partly in rations. A man-at-arms might receive daily pay of 6 pence, plus bread, ale, and a meat allowance. An archer earned less, perhaps 3 or 4 pence, but still got rations. Rations had cash value. A loaf of bread, a gallon of ale, a piece of saltfish, these were fungible. A soldier who saved his rations could sell them. A constable who shorted rations could pocket the difference. Watchmen on night duty received extra fuel for braziers. Cold men dozed. Dozing guards invited disaster. Therefore, fuel was part of the wage. In winter, fuel costs spiked. Firewood, charcoal, candles, lamp oil, all these kept a castle functional through dark months. A lord who skimped on warmth and light would lose his best men to better heated employers. The invisible payroll, hospitality. Not all compensation was recorded. Hospitality was currency. To sit at the lord's table on a feast day was worth more than a few extra pence. It signaled favor. It created obligation. Gifts flowed backward. Fish for the lord's kitchen, a fine hawk, a cask of wine from a grateful burgess whose stall fee was forgiven after a fire. These exchanges weren't accidents. They were the grease that kept lordship turning. The castle's splendor wasn't waste. It was signal. A fine hall communicated that the lord could afford generosity. Generosity purchased loyalty. Against this sat the cost of stinginess. A hall that served poor ale and short bread would empty. Retainers would drift to other lords. Soldiers would desert. Merchants would avoid the market. Stinginess was expensive in the long run. Part 6. Maintenance and Seasons. The annual cycle. Follow a year at a great port castle. In January and February, with the ground frozen and roads passable for heavy loads, stone carts rumble from quarries. Lime kilns burn day and night, eating cords of woodland. Carpenters cut centering for arches and fashion hoardings, wooden galleries that bolt to parapets if trouble comes. March and April see the arrival of stone boats downriver. Masons lay where frost permits. One team repairs a sallyport door. Another clears a culvert clogged by winter storms. May and June, the hall roof is stripped and re-lead. Old lead sheets are weighed and credited back. New sheets are listed by count and weight. The garrison slims to peacetime levels. A handful of men rotate night watches on the wall, day watches at the gate. July and August, the building season slows. Carts are needed for hay and harvest. Men return to their fields. On the coast, small boats still run timber and iron along shore. September and October. As fields empty, more hands can be hired at better rates. Autumn is prime building time inland. Mild weather, available labor, and roads still dry enough for carts. November and December. Masons can lay stone if frosts are light. Carpenters can always work under cover. The accounts reflect the seasons. Maintenance spreads out in small lines, but every so often a fat sum lands for lead or a major contract. Gutters, drains, and roofs. This is where castles lived or died, not in battle, but in weather. A gutter that clogged would overflow. Water ran down the inner face of a wall. In winter, it froze, expanded, and blew apart mortar. A crack appeared. Next winter, the crack widened. Within a decade, you had a structural problem. Within 2, you had a collapse. Drains had to be cleared seasonally. Leaves, silt, and debris would block a culvert. Water backed up, soaked foundations, turned courtyards into marshes. Roofs had to be maintained aggressively. Lead sheeting could last a century if properly installed, but if a single sheet worked loose, rain penetrated the timber below. Timber rotted, roof joists sagged, ceilings collapsed. The constable who spent money on these boring tasks saved money in the long run. The constable who deferred maintenance paid compound interest in catastrophe. The economics of neglect. Some castles were abandoned not because they were conquered, but because their owners couldn't afford upkeep. A baron's income had to cover many things: dowries, horses, lawsuits, alms, gifts. In a quiet region, the arithmetic might favor building a grand hall with large windows over maintaining a second curtain wall. Timber earthworks from earlier generations became money pits and were left to grass. In some lordships, the old motte was abandoned while a comfortable manor house rose nearby on easier ground. There were fewer castles in some English regions by 1300 than 100 years earlier, not because lordship faded, but because money chose differently. The opposite, the tower house boom. Yet in other places, the castle idea spread downward. In later medieval Ireland, thousands of tower houses rose. They were smaller, cheaper, more local. A prosperous merchant, a wealthy churchman, a gentry family, a Gaelic lord consolidating cattle wealth, any of these could build a 3- or 4-story tower house with battlements, a vaulted ground floor for storage, a stout timber door with an iron yett, a mural stair, a small hall above, and a status that spoke in stone. On the coast, tower houses doubled as secure warehouses. Herring fishing paid for ashlar. Quays buzzed, casks rolled, tolls accrued, and the tower looked down, collecting and protecting. In some fishing outports, several tower houses stood within a short walk of each other, a stone skyline built by seasonal profit. The castle was no longer only the prince's fortress, it was the merchant's safe. Part 7. Regional Variations. England and the Exchequer System. The English system, with its pipe rolls and exchequer audits, created a financial record unmatched in medieval Europe. We can track, year by year, which castles consumed the most money. Dover Castle, overlooking the Channel, was a persistent money sink. Henry II spent over £6,000 refurbishing it in the late 12th century, nearly a third of his annual income. The location was strategic. Dover controlled the narrowest crossing to the continent. It had to look formidable and function flawlessly. Scarborough, Nottingham, Windsor, the Tower of London, each had periods of heavy spending followed by quieter decades. The pattern reveals royal priorities: spend where threats loom, maintain elsewhere. Local sheriffs managed the flow of money, acting as regional finance officers. They collected taxes and rents, paid for works, and accounted to Westminster. A good sheriff kept the books balanced. A bad one found himself in arrears and facing royal displeasure. Wales, conquest and colonization. Edward I's Welsh program was conquest by construction. Between 1277 and 1304, he spent £80,000, more than his father and grandfather had spent on all English castles combined over 4 decades. The results were extraordinary. Caernarfon, with its imperial ambitions written in banded masonry and angular towers. Conway, with 8 massive towers and a complete circuit of town walls. Harlech, perched on a crag with a water gate descending to the sea. Beaumaris, the most sophisticated concentric castle never completed. These weren't just military hardware, they were propaganda. Edward was saying, in stone, "This land is mine, and I have the resources to prove it permanently." The financial strain was enormous. By 1295, Edward was borrowing from Italian bankers and pawning royal jewels. The Welsh revolts of 1294 forced additional spending just to repair damage. But the investment worked. Welsh independence was crushed. English rule was entrenched. The castles stood, visible and permanent, for centuries. The Rhine and toll economics. Shift to the Rhine Valley. Here, castles were economic infrastructure. A fortress on a river island or a narrow gorge could control barge traffic. Chains stretched across the water. Merchant vessels stopped and paid. These toll castles rarely saw battle. Their weapon was position. Geography did the work, stone enforced it. A minor nobleman with a single tower and a chain could extract wealth from the Holy Roman Empire's richest trade artery. The same logic applied to Alpine passes, Adriatic harbors, and Danube crossings. Wherever trade flowed through a bottleneck, a fortress with a customs post made economic sense. The Teutonic Order, brick empires. In the Baltic, the Teutonic Order built an empire of brick. Their castles at Marienburg, Königsberg, and along the Vistula were part monastery, part military base, part agribusiness headquarters. These weren't simple fortresses. They were administrative campuses, chapter houses, dormitories, refectories, breweries, granaries, stables, chapels, treasuries, courts, and archives, all under one roof system. The order managed vast landed estates. Grain grown in Prussia was shipped to markets in Flanders. Timber felled in Lithuanian forests was floated downriver to Baltic ports. Tolls and customs fed the system. The result was a hybrid institution: knights who kept ledgers, monks who commanded armies, bureaucrats who also took vows. It was a unique solution to the problem of organizing a frontier state with limited manpower and unlimited ambition. Iberia, frontier fortresses and settlement charters. On the frontiers of Castile and Leon, castles anchored settlement. After territory was reconquered from Muslim rule, it had to be populated and defended. The solution was the consejos, chartered towns with associated fortifications. Settlers received privileges, tax holidays, market rights, freedom from certain feudal obligations. In return, they agreed to live in a dangerous border zone and man the walls when needed. The economic model was simple: reduce taxes to attract people, let them generate wealth through farming and trade, then gradually increase taxes as the region stabilized. It worked because the alternative, empty land, produced zero revenue and invited reconquest. Castles in Iberia also controlled transhumance routes, the seasonal migration paths of vast sheep flocks between highlands and lowlands. Wool was wealth. A fortress that could protect shepherds and tax their passage was a fiscal winner. Italy, urban fortifications and factional towers. Italian city-states developed their own fortification culture. Instead of royal castles dominating rural hinterlands, you found urban towers, family strongholds within city walls built by rival factions. These towers were both residences and military assets. During factional conflicts, they became mini fortresses. Between wars, they were symbols of lineage and prestige. Communal governments also built citadels, the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence, the castles of Milan and Ferrara. These combined government functions, treasuries, arsenals, and prisons. They were civic castles, built and paid for by urban tax revenues. The economics differed from Northern Europe. Instead of feudal rents and manorial dues, Italian castles were funded by taxes on commerce, gate tolls, sales taxes, tariffs on imports. The wealth of Mediterranean trade, spices, silk, dyes, was reflected in the sophistication of Italian urban fortifications. Part 8. People and Skills. The Master Mason. At the top of the construction hierarchy was the Master Mason. He wasn't just a builder, he was an architect, engineer, and project manager. Master James of St. George, Edward I's chief architect, is the best documented example. Born Jacques de Saint-Georges d'Espéranche in Savoy, he had built castles for the Count of Savoy before Edward recruited him. By 1278, James was in Wales, and for the next 30 years, he would be the organizing genius behind Edward's fortifications. His contract was generous, 3 shillings a day, when a laborer earned a shilling a week, plus an estate in Wales, plus a pension. In return, Edward got brilliance. James designed Harlech, Beaumaris, and Conway, supervised construction at Caernarfon, and managed the complex logistics of building multiple fortresses simultaneously. A master mason needed to understand mathematics, geometry for arches, proportion for stability. He needed to read terrain and geology. He needed to manage hundreds of workers across different trades. He needed to estimate costs, negotiate contracts, and keep royal patrons satisfied. His drawings and plans rarely survived, but his buildings speak for themselves. The elegant efficiency of James's designs, the way towers cover walls, the way gates funnel attackers into kill zones, the way residential space is carved from defensive bulk, shows a mind that thought in 3 dimensions and calculated in pounds sterling simultaneously. The specialized trades. Below the master mason came a pyramid of skills. Freestone masons cut and dressed fine stone for corners, door frames, window tracery, the visible, prestigious work. They used iron chisels, wooden mallets, and an eye trained over years. Rough masons laid rubble and mortar for wall cores and less visible sections. This was faster, cheaper work, but still required judgment about bonding and drainage. Quarrymen knew stone. They could read a rock face and see where natural bedding planes would make splitting easier. They used wedges, picks, and sometimes fire to crack stone free from the living rock. Lime burners operated kilns that transformed limestone into quicklime through intense heat. The chemistry was exact. Too little heat and you got nothing, too much and you wasted fuel. A good lime burner saved a castle significant money. Carpenters built the invisible architecture, scaffolding that let masons reach high walls, centering that held arches until mortar cured, hoists and cranes that lifted stone. They also built permanent structures, roof timbers, floors, doors, shutters, and the wooden hoardings that projected from battlements during sieges. Smiths made and maintained tools. A chisel used on hard stone dulled quickly. A castle site might have a dedicated forge just for sharpening and repairing masons' tools. Smiths also forged structural ironwork, hinges, door hardware, window grills, and portcullis mechanisms. Plumbers worked with lead, casting sheets for roofs, forming gutters and downspouts, creating the water systems that kept cisterns filled and drains flowing. Each trade had its own economy of apprenticeship, tools, and reputation. A skilled craftsman could travel between sites following the money. An unskilled laborer was easier to replace, but still essential. Someone had to carry the mortar, haul the stones, and dig the foundations. Women in the castle economy. Women appear less often in building accounts, but they were present. Women carried materials, cleared rubble, and performed unskilled labor for lower wages than men, typically half to two-thirds of male rates for comparable work. Inside the household, women dominated textile production, food preparation, and household management. The lady of a castle oversaw provisioning, managed estates when her husband was absent, and could command considerable authority. In urban contexts attached to castles, women ran alehouses, market stalls, and workshops. Widows often continued their late husband's businesses. A merchant's widow might control a tower house and its associated revenues. The economic contribution was real even when the documentation is sparse. The human cost. Castle building was dangerous. Falls from scaffolding killed. Stone crushed feet and hands. Quarry collapses buried workers. Infections from minor wounds could turn fatal. There are occasional entries in accounts for payments to injured workers or to widows of men killed on site. These were modest sums, reflecting the brutal arithmetic of medieval labor. A dead worker could be replaced. Yet skilled workers had leverage. A master carpenter who knew how to build complex roof trusses, a mason who could cut intricate tracery, these men could negotiate better conditions because they were harder to replace. The seasonal nature of work also created hardship. A laborer employed during building season might have no income in winter. Households survived through networks of obligation, shared resources, and, when necessary, charity from monasteries and churches. Part 9. Law, Justice, and the Castle Court. The castle as legal hub. Medieval justice was local, and the castle was where it happened. The Lord's Court met in the Great Hall or a chamber attached to it. Cases were heard, fines levied, disputes settled. The court was an economic engine. Every fine, every amercement, every fee for registering a land transfer went into the Lord's coffers. Justice wasn't just about order, it was revenue. Types of cases varied. The honorial court dealt with disputes between the Lord's tenants, property boundaries, inheritance, breaches of tenure agreements. The view of frank pledge, held twice yearly, checked on local tithings, groups of households mutually responsible for each other's behavior, and collected fees. The sheriff's turn, or shire court, handled more serious criminal matters and royal business. When held in a castle, it brought people from across the county, creating opportunities for secondary economic activity, markets outside the gates, food and drink vendors, scribes offering their services. Weights, measures, and market regulation. One of the most economically important functions of castle administration was standardization. The Lord's officials maintained official weights and measures, sealed and certified for accuracy. A bushel of grain, a gallon of ale, an ell of cloth, these had to be consistent for markets to function. The castle kept master standards. Merchants and traders would have their measures tested and marked as legitimate. Violators faced fines. A baker who sold underweight loaves would be hauled before the castle court. An alewife who watered her product would be fined and possibly pilloried. These weren't just moral judgments, they were economic regulation. Fair measures built trust. Trust brought trade. Trade generated tolls and rents. The assize of bread and ale was a royal regulation fixing the relationship between grain prices and the weight or strength of bread and beer. When grain was expensive, a loaf couldn't be smaller, but it could be lighter in weight. When grain was cheap, loaves were heavier. This sliding scale was meant to protect consumers while allowing bakers and brewers to survive. Castle courts enforced the assize. Officials tested ale for strength and bread for weight. The castle's dungeon might house violators until they paid their fines. The system wasn't perfect, but it worked better than no regulation at all. Forest law and poaching. Where a castle controlled royal forests or private hunting grounds, forest law was serious business. Deer, boar, and other game were reserved for the lord. Poaching was both a crime and an economic threat. It stole a resource the lord considered his property. Forest courts met regularly, imposing fines for unauthorized hunting, woodcutting, or grazing. The fines could be substantial. A peasant caught with venison might lose a year's income in penalties. From the lord's perspective, this was rational. The deer park represented investment. Walls or fencing, gamekeepers' wages, controlled breeding. Poachers were thieves, stealing a capital asset. From the peasant's perspective, it was often survival. A bad harvest might mean protein was scarce. A deer in the forest was food going to waste while children went hungry. The tension was real and permanent. Castle accounts occasionally note payments to foresters for capturing poachers or fines collected from convicted offenders. The sums were small individually but added up over a year. Prison and ransom. Castles served as prisons, especially for high-status captives. A captured knight or nobleman wasn't simply locked away, he was a financial asset. Medieval warfare operated on a ransom system. Capture a knight, negotiate a ransom based on his wealth and status, and release him when paid. The castle's dungeon or a secure chamber would hold the prisoner. Meanwhile, his family raised money, often by selling land or borrowing from merchants. The ransom payment could be enormous, sometimes a year's income or more. For the captor, this was a windfall. One successful capture in battle could pay for years of castle maintenance. For the prisoner's family, it was a crushing burden. The castle's role was practical, provide secure custody until payment arrived. Guards had to be paid, and the prisoner, if of high status, might expect decent treatment, reasonable food and accommodation fitting his rank. That cost money too, but it was an investment against the much larger ransom. Part 10. Crisis and Siege. When war came to the walls. Siege warfare inverted the normal economy. A castle that in peacetime operated on a budget of a few £100 annually could suddenly consume thousands. First came preparation. Grain, salted meat, ale, and wine had to be stockpiled. Wells were checked and repaired, cisterns filled. Extra lead, timber, and stone were brought in for emergency repairs. The garrison swelled. Knights, men-at-arms, archers, crossbowmen, engineers. Then came the siege itself. Attackers built siege engines, trebuchets that flung stones weighing hundreds of pounds, mangonels for anti-personnel work, siege towers, battering rams. Defenders countered with their own artillery, and sorties could destroy enemy equipment. Both sides burned through resources. Defenders used arrows and crossbow bolts by the thousands. Attackers needed constant supplies of food, timber for engines, and stone or lead for projectiles. A long siege could bankrupt both sides. The attacker had to feed an army in the field, often in hostile territory where foraging was dangerous. The defender watched supplies dwindle and made brutal calculations about rationing. The economics of surrender. Surrender negotiations often revolved around money. A garrison might agree to yield if not relieved within a certain time, say 40 days. This allowed both sides to avoid the bloodshed and cost of a final assault. The terms might include safe passage for the garrison, return of seized goods, or payment of a symbolic fine. Sometimes the castle's constable negotiated a payment to himself in exchange for yielding, though this was risky, it could be seen as treason. From an economic standpoint, negotiated surrender made sense. An assault was expensive and unpredictable. Even if successful, the attacker might suffer heavy casualties and then face the cost of repairing a battered fortress. Better to offer terms that let the defenders leave with honor. For the defenders, holding out too long was dangerous. If the castle fell by storm rather than surrender, the garrison could be slaughtered and no ransom would be paid. The constable had to judge when further resistance was pointless. Slighting and repair. If a castle changed hands in a way that made future defense impractical or undesirable, it might be slighted, deliberately damaged to render it unusable. Slighting was surprisingly expensive. You couldn't just abandon a castle. An enemy might repair and reoccupy it. You had to break it, topple towers, smash gates, fill wells, collapse roofs. This required labor and sometimes explosives. Undermining a wall took time and skill. Burning timber structures was easier, but didn't always work. Stone resisted fire. After a conflict, the cost of repair could be staggering. Rebuilding a slighted castle often cost as much as building a new one. That's why many slighted fortresses were never repaired. They became ruins and eventually quarries for local builders who hauled away the stone. Part 11. Late Medieval Transitions. The Gunpowder Revolution. Gunpowder arrived in Europe in the 14th century, but it took decades to change castle economics significantly. Early cannon were unreliable, expensive, and not much more effective than traditional siege engines. By the 15th century, that changed. Improved metallurgy and gun-founding techniques produced cannon capable of battering down walls. Stone fortifications that had resisted sieges for centuries could now be breached in days. The economic response was dramatic. Walls had to be redesigned. Thicker, lower, angled to deflect shot. Bastions projected outward to provide flanking fire. Ditches deepened. Earthworks absorbed impact better than stone. This new style, called the Trace Italienne in its mature form, was monumentally expensive. Only major states and wealthy cities could afford it. Private lords couldn't keep up. The result was a shift in military architecture. Royal and urban fortifications absorbed the innovation and the cost. Private castles increasingly focused on comfort over defense. A manor house with token battlements replaced the serious fortress. The rise of the tower house. Yet fortification didn't disappear. It scaled down. The late medieval tower house was a brilliant economic compromise. Defensible enough to deter raiders, cheap enough for gentry and merchants to afford, compact enough to heat and staff. Ireland saw thousands built between the 14th and 17th centuries. Scotland developed its own tradition. In northern England, pale towers served similar functions. A typical tower house was 3 to 5 stories tall. The ground floor, with a vaulted stone ceiling, served as a secure storeroom. The entrance was on the first floor, reached by an external stair that could be removed or destroyed if attacked. A spiral stair within the wall thickness connected floors. The hall occupied the second floor, private chambers above. Building one cost a fraction of a curtain wall castle, but still marked you as someone of substance. The investment was proportional and sensible. From fortress to residence. Many castles underwent a transition from military to residential focus. Great halls grew larger and more comfortable. Windows expanded. Chimneys multiplied. Gardens were laid out within courtyards. This wasn't decadence, it was adaptation. In regions where royal authority reduced the likelihood of private warfare, investing in defense made less sense than investing in hospitality and display. A lord who could host impressive feasts, accommodate important visitors comfortably, and display sophisticated taste gained political capital. That capital was as valuable as military readiness had been in earlier centuries. The economics followed. Money that once went to battlements now went to glazing, tapestries, carved woodwork, and gardens. The building was still called a castle, but its function had shifted. Urban walls and civic identity. Cities invested heavily in fortifications through the late Middle Ages and beyond. Unlike private lords, urban governments could tax their populations to fund walls. Grants of murage, the right to collect tolls specifically for wall construction and repair, gave cities a dedicated revenue stream. Citizens often took pride in their walls, seeing them as symbols of liberty and self-government. Urban fortifications were also practical. Walls allowed cities to control trade, collect customs, and exclude undesirables. Gates closed at night, providing security. In wartime, walls were essential. The cost was substantial. A circuit of walls for a medium-sized city could cost tens of thousands of pounds spread over decades. But the investment paid off in increased trade, higher property values, and enhanced political status. Some cities assigned sections of wall to guilds or parishes for maintenance. The Bakers' Guild might be responsible for one tower, the Weavers' Guild for another. This distributed the cost and created a sense of collective ownership. Part 12. Castles as Memory. The long life of stone. One paradox of castle economics, the initial investment was enormous, but the structure lasted for centuries. A castle built in 1100 might still be functional in 1400, even if modified. This longevity changed the cost-benefit calculation. Spread over 300 years, even a 10,000 fortress became a reasonable expense, about £33 annually in pure capital cost, far less than annual maintenance. Of course, the real cost was maintenance, wages, and operations, which recurred every year. But the point remains, stone was an investment in permanence. A timber castle might rot and require rebuilding every generation. Stone, properly maintained, could outlast dynasties. Castles as quarries. When castles were finally abandoned, they often became quarries. Local people hauled away stone for barns, houses, and bridges. In England, many monasteries dissolved by Henry VIII saw their buildings repurposed this way. From an economic standpoint, this made perfect sense. Why quarry new stone when shaped blocks were sitting unused? The castle had been built with great expense. Now its materials subsidized construction elsewhere. Ironically, some castles survive precisely because they were remote or built from poor quality stone. If the stone wasn't worth hauling, the ruin remained. Romantic ruins and tourism. By the 18th and 19th century, ruined castles acquired a new economic value: tourism and romanticism. Artists painted them, poets wrote about them, and wealthy travelers visited them. Some landowners maintained ruins as picturesque features on their estates. Others charged admission. The castle, which had once generated income through tolls and rents, now generated income through aesthetics. This wasn't trivial. In the 19th century, the ruins of castles like Tintern and Kenilworth attracted enough visitors to support local economies. Guidebooks were published, inns catered to tourists, souvenirs were sold. The medieval fortress had become a commodity again, but in a form its builders never imagined. Part 13. Comparative Perspectives. Byzantine and Islamic Fortifications. So far, we've focused on Western Europe, but castle economics operated differently in the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Byzantine fortifications emphasized repair and adaptation of existing structures. Constantinople's walls, built in the 5th century, were maintained and modified for 1,000 years. The city's wealth allowed continuous investment. Byzantine military manuals discuss fortress logistics in detail: how much grain for how many soldiers, how to calculate water needs, how to organize supply chains. The Byzantines thought systematically about siege economics in ways Western Europeans would only match centuries later. Islamic fortifications, particularly Crusader-era castles in Syria and Palestine, show sophisticated water management and supply storage. Crac des Chevaliers could hold a garrison of 2,000 and endure a multi-year siege. Its cisterns, granaries, and magazines were designed with mathematical precision. The economic model was different too. Many of these fortresses were maintained through ikta, land grants that generated revenue for military purposes. The system resembled Western feudalism, but with more centralized oversight. Mongol and Central Asian approaches. The Mongol Empire, despite its nomadic origins, built and captured fortresses across Eurasia. Their approach was pragmatic: use local expertise, adopt what works, and fund fortifications through tribute and trade control. Caravanserais, fortified roadside inns, played an economic role similar to European toll castles. They provided security for merchants, extracted fees, and served as administrative nodes. The Silk Road's profitability depended on this infrastructure. In Central Asia, citadels controlled irrigation systems. Control water, control agriculture, control tax revenue. The fortress was less about walls than about hydrology and agricultural surplus. Japanese castles, a different economic logic. Japanese castles developed differently due to geography, materials, and social structure. Most were built primarily of wood and earth, with stone foundations and walls. This made them cheaper to build but required more maintenance. The Japanese castle was the center of a han, a feudal domain. It combined military, administrative, and economic functions. Castle towns, jokamachi, developed around major fortresses, with rigid social zoning, samurai districts, merchant quarters, temple areas. The daimyo, feudal lord, derived income from rice production in his domain. The castle stored rice both as food and as currency. Samurai were often paid in rice stipends. This rice-based economy created different logistics, massive granaries, careful accounting of harvests, complex systems for converting rice to other goods. When the Tokugawa shogunate restricted castle construction in the 17th century, it was explicitly an economic measure. Limiting castle building prevented daimyo from accumulating excessive military power and bankrupting themselves on construction, either of which could threaten the regime. Part 14. Counterfactuals and Conclusions. What if castles had been cheaper? One thought experiment: imagine castle construction cost half as much as it did. More castles would have been built. Smaller lords would have fortified. The landscape would be dotted with more strongholds. Would this have been better? Probably not. The high cost of castles was a form of barrier to entry. It limited who could project military power. In a world where anyone of moderate means could build a fortress, warfare would have been more fragmented and chronic. The expense of castles centralized violence. Only kings, great lords, and wealthy cities could afford them. This concentration of fortification helped, eventually, concentrate state power. What if maintenance had been free? Another thought experiment. Suppose stone required no maintenance. No roofs to re-lead, no mortar to repoint, no drains to clear. Castles would have lasted longer, in functional condition. Fewer would have been abandoned. The ruins we see today might still be inhabited. But this misses a deeper point. Maintenance costs were a feature, not a bug. They ensured that only serious, stable institutions could maintain fortresses long-term. A bandit couldn't hold a castle for decades. He lacked the administrative capacity to keep it functional. A legitimate lord with steady revenues could. Maintenance costs were a filter. They separated temporary from permanent power. The real legacy. The economic history of medieval castles teaches several lessons that transcend stone and mortar. First, infrastructure is expensive but essential. Societies that invest in stability through fortifications, law enforcement, courts, and administration create conditions for prosperity. The cost is upfront and visible. The benefit is diffuse and long-term. Second, maintenance matters more than glamour. The boring work of keeping systems functional is more important than spectacular new construction. A well-maintained castle from 1100 outperformed a neglected castle from 1250. Third, economics and power are inseparable. Military strength required money. Money required economic activity. Economic activity required security. Security required fortifications. The circle was complete and self-reinforcing. Fourth, scale matters. Small, cheap fortifications proliferate but accomplish less. Large, expensive fortifications concentrate power and shape regions. The economic barrier to entry is itself a feature of the system. Fifth, obsolescence is inevitable. No matter how much you spend, technology and tactics evolve. The stone castle that seemed eon in 1300 was outdated by 1500. But the economic and administrative functions persisted. They just moved into different buildings. The final account. Let's end where we began, with the paperwork. A medieval castle was recorded three ways. First, in surveys and inventories, lists of towers, walls, chambers, stores. Second, in accounts, endless rows of expenses and revenues. Third, in charters and grants, the legal documents that made the castle's economic rights enforceable. These three types of documents together capture the reality better than any romantic painting or modern photograph. They show the castle as its contemporaries understood it, a machine for converting resources into stability, with all the maintenance, expense, and complexity that entailed. Today, we visit castle ruins and see beauty. But the medieval constable, looking at the same walls, saw a different kind of beauty. Accounts balanced, stores full, walls sound, garrison paid, rents collected, courts functioning, markets thriving. That was the economics of medieval castles. Not dragons or damsels, not even primarily battles. It was bread and ale, lead and lime, wages and rents, tolls and taxes. It was the patient work of making order from chaos, one receipt at a time. The stones remember, the ledgers tell the truth. Part 15. The Unseen Hierarchy, the Domestic Staff. When we picture a castle, we see the lord and lady, the knights and the soldiers, but these high-status individuals were a tiny minority. A great castle was not a fortress, it was a hotel with a permanent, massive staff organized into a rigid and complex hierarchy that had little to do with warfare and everything to do with service. This hierarchy was the household below stairs. Its economy was based on specialization, tradition, and precise, monotonous ritual. The Great Chain of Service. The household was often split into departments, each managed by a high-ranking officer. 1. The steward, the CEO. The steward, or seneschal, was the chief of staff. He didn't just manage the castle, he often managed all of the lord's estates. He presided over the manorial ports, as we discussed in Part 9, audited the accounts from the reeves, and negotiated leases. Economically, he was the lord's financial controller. He approved major purchases. He oversaw the tally sticks and the pipe rolls. When the lord was absent, the steward held the power. His salary was immense, often paid not in coin, but in the rights to his own manor, rent-free. 2. The marshal, the head of logistics. While marshal sounds military, his primary role was transport and security. He was in charge of the stables, the horses, the grooms, and the farriers. This was a massive economic responsibility. A knight's warhorse, destrier, was the medieval equivalent of a tank, colossally expensive to buy, feed, and armor. The marshal managed this vehicle pool. He accounted for every bushel of oats, every new horseshoe. When the lord traveled, which was often, the marshal organized the entire caravan, the pack mules for treasure, the carts for bedding, the wagons for the kitchen supplies. He was the master of logistics. 3. The chamberlain, the personal accounts. If the steward managed the public finances of the estate, the chamberlain managed the private finances of the lord's personal chamber. This was the lord's inner sanctum, his bedroom and private office. The chamberlain was in charge of the lord's personal wardrobe, another sign of immense wealth, his jewels, and his privy purse, the cash box for daily expenses, tips, and charitable alms. He was the ultimate trusted servant, often sleeping at the foot of the lord's bed. He paid the minstrels, the messengers, and anyone who required a direct, personal payment from the lord. The departments of consumption. Below these big three, the household fractured into specialized departments dedicated to consumption. 1. The buttery, the drinks. Run by the butler, from the Old French boutier, or bottle bearer. This department had nothing to do with food. It was solely responsible for drink. The butler managed the vast cellars of ale and wine. He accounted for every cask. He knew which wine was aging, which was ready, and which was turning to vinegar, a real economic loss. His team, the yeomen of the buttery, was responsible for serving drinks in the Great Hall, ensuring the lord's cup was never empty, but also ensuring that lower-ranking knights didn't drink the expensive imported French wine meant only for the high table. 2. The pantry, the bread. Run by the panteleur, from the French panetier, or breadman. This department controlled bread and only bread. This seems mundane, but bread was the staple food, the literal measure of sustenance. The pantry stored grain, managed the castle's bakery, the bakehouse, and accounted for flour. The panteleur was responsible for the trenchers, thick slices of stale bread used as plates. After the meal, these gravy-soaked trenchers were either given to the poor as alms, an economic cost, or, in less generous households, rebaked into breadcrumbs to be used again, an economic saving. 3. The larder, the meat. Run by the larderer. This was the castle's cold storage and butcher shop. The larderer managed the salting tubs, the smokehouses, and the inventory of preserved meats. He accounted for every side of bacon, every barrel of salt herring. His job was a constant battle against rot, rats, and weevils. A mistake by the larderer could poison the entire household. 4. The kitchen, the production line. Run by the head cook. The medieval kitchen was not a cozy room. It was a loud, hot, smoky factory. It had multiple massive fireplaces, one for roasting spits, turned by small boys called spitjacks, one for cauldrons of soup, and separate ovens. The cook was a high-status, high-wage professional. He managed a team of specialists, sauce makers, pastry chefs, and scullions, the dishwashers. The kitchen's economy was based on fuel, massive amounts of firewood, and waste. A good cook knew how to turn yesterday's leftover roast into today's meat pie, stretching the Lord's budget while appearing magnificent. The invisible workforce. Finally, there was the mass of servants who had no high title, but without whom the castle would cease to function in a day. The laundress, an endless, grueling job. Lye, made from wood ash, was the primary soap, a harsh chemical. Clothes weren't washed, they were pounded, boiled, and bleached in fields. The reeve, a man, often a peasant himself, elected or appointed to oversee the agricultural work on the domain lands. He was the middleman between the steward and the field laborers. The gong farmer, the most unpleasant job of all. This was the man paid to empty the garderobes, latrines. This work was done only at night. He would climb down into the cesspit at the base of the castle wall, shovel the contents into a cart, and haul it away to be used as fertilizer. It was a vital public health job, and because it was so disgusting, it was often surprisingly well paid. This entire domestic system, this city of servants, clerks, and specialists, was the true economic engine of the castle. It consumed the wealth the estate produced, and in doing so, it projected the power that made the system possible. Part 16. The Economics of Filth and Fragrance. We often romanticize the past, but the medieval castle was, by modern standards, an assault on the senses. The economics of daily life were dominated by a constant, expensive, and often losing battle against filth. The tyranny of waste, garderobes, and drains. We discussed the gong farmer, but the design of waste management was an economic choice. A castle's latrine was called a garderobe. It was typically a small room or closet built into the thickness of the outer wall, with a stone seat and a vertical shaft opening straight down. Where did it go? Option 1. The moat. In many castles, like Caerphilly, the shafts emptied directly into the moat. This was cheap and efficient, turning the moat into an open sewer. The economic cost was biological. The water became septic, a breeding ground for disease. Option 2. The cesspit. In others, the shaft led to a sealed cesspit at the base of the wall. This was cleaner, but required the expensive, recurring labor of the gong farmer to empty it. Option 3. The river. Castles built on rivers, like the Tower of London, often had latrine shafts built out over the water, letting the current carry the waste away. This was the premium solution. The household also produced tons of gray water, waste from the kitchens, grease, blood, vegetable scraps, and laundry, lye, dirt. This couldn't go into the main sewer shafts. It required dedicated drains and gutters. As we learned in The Tyranny of Water, if these drains clogged, they didn't just smell, they soaked the foundations and destroyed the castle. Therefore, a significant portion of the boring maintenance budget was spent on plumbing. The floor economy, rushes and herbs. Castle floors were not bare stone. They were covered, but not with expensive carpets. Those were hung on walls as tapestries to show wealth and block drafts. The floors were covered with rushes. Rushes, like straw or reeds, were cut from marshlands, bundled, and spread thick upon the floor. They acted as a disposable, insulating layer. This created a unique microeconomy. The cost. Rushes had to be harvested, carted, and spread, a labor cost. The problem. People ate at tables, and scraps fell into the rushes. Dogs slept, urinated, and left bones in the rushes. Owl was spilled. Mud was tracked in. The solution? You didn't clean the rushes, you just added a new layer on top. Erasmus, visiting England much later, complained that some castle halls had 20-year-old layers of rushes, the bottom of which contained an ancient collection of spittle, vomit, wine, owl, scraps of food, and everything else that is too nasty to be mentioned. This was a biological time bomb. To combat the smell, and they hoped the disease or miasma, the household budget included large purchases of aromatic herbs. Mint, lavender, chamomile, and thyme were scattered among the new rushes. The smell of a medieval hall was not clean. It was a heavy, perfumed mask covering the stench of decay. This floor economy was a constant cycle of purchasing rushes, purchasing herbs, and eventually paying for the massive labor of mucking out the entire hall down to the stone. The fragrance economy, incense and pomander. Fragrance was not a luxury, it was a necessity. It was the medieval equivalent of air conditioning. Incense. The castle chapel burned incense daily. This was partly religious, but also practical. The heavy, resinous smoke of frankincense and myrrh was believed to purify the air and drive away sickness, the miasma. Incense was expensive, often imported from the Middle East, and represented a significant line item in the chapel's budget. Pomanders. A high-status lord or lady would not walk around unprotected. They carried a pomander, a small perforated metal ball filled with exotic spices, musk or ambergris, a colossally expensive whale byproduct. When walking through a smelly part of the castle or town, they would hold this to their nose. The pomander was a status symbol. It signaled that you were wealthy enough to create your own personal bubble of pleasant-smelling air. The economics of a castle were therefore a constant war between sanitation and stench. A significant portion of the budget was spent not on swords, but on straw, mint, incense, and lye, all in a desperate attempt to keep the fortress physically habitable. Part 17. The Economics of Time, Bells and Clocks. How did this massive, complex machine of 300 servants and soldiers stay synchronized? Today, we have digital schedules. In the Middle Ages, they had sound. The economy of the castle was regulated by bells. The rhythm of the bells. Life was not governed by the 9 to 5 clock. It was governed by the audible signals that marked the day. The chapel bell, the most important timekeeper. The monks or priests in the castle chapel followed the canonical hours. Bells rang for matins, before dawn, lauds, dawn, prime, approx 6 a.m., terce, 9 a.m., sext, noon, none, 3 p.m., vespers, sunset, and compline, end of day. The castle bell, the great bell. This was the secular clock. The waking bell rang at sunrise. This signaled the start of the economic day. The gates were opened, the cooks fired the ovens, the stable hands began feeding the horses. The dinner bell rang mid-morning, approx 10 a.m., This was the main meal of the day. All labor stopped. The household gathered in the Great Hall. The curfew bell, from French couvre-feu, cover the fire, rang at sunset, approx 8 or 9 p.m. This was the shutdown signal. The gates were locked. All fires had to be banked or extinguished, a critical fire prevention rule in a building full of timber and straw. The markets closed. Alehouses shut. The workday was officially over. This acoustic schedule was the economy. You didn't clock in, you simply started work when the waking bell rang and stopped when the curfew bell rang. The introduction of the mechanical clock. The late Middle Ages saw the introduction of the first mechanical clocks. These were not small mantelpiece clocks, they were massive, weight-driven iron machines. They were, at first, objects of pure astronomical prestige. A lord would commission a clock for his castle not just to tell time, but to show that he could afford to own time. These early clocks were notoriously inaccurate and required a new high-wage specialist, the clock keeper or horologist. The clock keeper's job was to regulate the clock daily against a sundial if the sun was out, clean the complex iron gears, and rewind the massive stone weights that powered it. Economically, the clock was a transition. It began as a status symbol, like a deer park, but over time it shifted. As it became more reliable, it allowed for the standardization of labor. Instead of paying a man for a day, sunrise to sunset, which varied, the clock allowed lords to start paying by the hour. This was a profound economic shift. The castle bell announced the day's rhythm. The mechanical clock dictated it. The move from the bell to the clock hand was the beginning of the end of the medieval economic mindset and the dawn of the modern one. Part 18. The Economy of Sickness. The Infirmary. We have discussed the economics of filth and waste and the constant battle against decay. But what happened when that battle was lost? What was the economy of sickness? In a fortress of hundreds, disease was not a possibility, it was a statistical certainty. A single infected soldier, a bad batch of ale, or a contaminated well could cripple a garrison faster than any trebuchet. The castle, therefore, had to be a hospital, and hospitals, then as now, cost money. The infirmerer and his budget. The medical professional of the castle was not always a doctor. In a monastic castle, like those of the Teutonic Order, or a large household, this role fell to the infirmerer. The infirmerer was a monk or clerk responsible for the infirmary, a separate building or quiet hall where the sick were housed. His job was part nurse, part administrator, and his accounts were a fascinating record of medieval medicine. His budget was primarily spent on three things: herbs, leeches, and comfort. 1. The herb budget, the physic garden. The infirmary often had its own dedicated garden, the physic garden or herb garden. This was an essential economic asset. Growing your own medicine was infinitely cheaper than buying it. This garden was a living pharmacy, meticulously organized. For pain, poppies for opium, or willow bark containing salicin, the basis for aspirin. For wounds, yarrow, an antiseptic, comfrey, called knitbone, believed to help mend fractures, and sphagnum moss, which is highly absorbent and acidic, making it an excellent sterile dressing. For digestion, mint, fennel, and chamomile. For purging, hellebore and other emetics, believed to purge the body of bad humors. When the garden couldn't provide, the infirmerer had to purchase ingredients. His accounts would show small, regular payments for exotic imports, peppercorns, ginger, or dried rosemary, all believed to have powerful balancing properties for the body's four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. 2. The leech and bloodletting economy. The core of medieval medical theory was balance. Sickness was seen as an imbalance of these humors. The most common treatment was to remove a surplus of bad blood. Leeches. The infirmerer would have to purchase and maintain a supply of medicinal leeches. They were kept in special clay jars with moss and water. They were, in essence, single-use, sterile surgical tools. Cupping and lancing. Alternatively, a barber surgeon would be paid a fee. Note the title, barber surgeon. The same man who cut the lord's hair and shaved his beard was often the one paid to perform minor surgery, pull teeth, and bleed patients. This was a trade, not an academic pursuit. 3. The comfort budget, the price of healing. The infirmerer's accounts also show an increase in luxury items. It was understood that the sick needed better care. Better food. The sick were often excused from the standard castle diet of salt meat and heavy bread. The infirmerer's budget included purchases of fresh chicken, for broth, eggs, and white bread, made from finer flour, easier to digest. Better wine. A small amount of strong, spiced wine was often prescribed as a tonic. Fuel. The infirmary was kept warmer than the rest of the castle, requiring a larger than average budget for firewood. The high cost of a doctor. For a common soldier, the barber surgeon was the only option, but if the lord or lady fell truly ill, the castle would summon a physician. This was an entirely different economic class. A physician was a university-educated man, almost never a woman, who had studied Galen and Hippocrates. He was an academic. He would rarely perform surgery. His job was to diagnose. He would arrive with his vade-mecum, a folded book of charts, and perform an elaborate diagnosis based on the color, smell, and even taste of the patient's urine. His fee was astronomical. A single consultation from a famous physician could cost more than paying a dozen men-at-arms for a month. This payment was a status symbol, proof that the lord could afford the absolute best academic mind, even if the physician's only prescription was rest and pray. The economy of sickness, therefore, was a mirror of the castle's social structure. Common soldiers received practical, herbal, and surgical care from the barber. The lord received expensive academic theory from the physician, and the infirmarer's ledger quietly recorded the cost of it all. Part 19. The Economy of Joy, Feasts and Festivals. The monotonous, bell-driven economy of the castle was punctuated by sudden, massive bursts of spending. These were the feasts. A feast was not just a big dinner. It was a political and economic statement. It was the lord's primary way of converting his wealth, grain, cattle, wine, into his power, loyalty, status, obligation. The feast as economic warfare. When a lord hosted a feast for a rival baron or a visiting king, he was engaging in economic warfare. The goal was to display such overwhelming, casual abundance that the guest would be intimidated. You have an army, but I have so much food I can afford to waste it. You struggle to feed your household, I feed 500 people on a Tuesday. This was conspicuous consumption. The more extensive and useless the display, the more powerful the message. The anatomy of a feast budget. When the steward was ordered to prepare a feast, his normal budget was thrown out the window. The spending became frantic and focused on rare luxuries. 1. The subtlety, the sugar economy. The highlight of the feast was the subtlety, or sotelty. This was a massive, intricate sculpture made entirely of sugar. Sugar was an absurdly expensive imported luxury, seen as a spice, not a sweetener. The castle cook, or a hired specialist, would sculpt sugar paste into fantasies, castles, knights on horseback, mythological scenes, or political allegories. This sculpture was paraded through the hall, admired, and not eaten. Its entire economic purpose was to be seen and then thrown away. It was the ultimate statement. I am so wealthy, I can build a sculpture out of a substance more expensive than most spices and then destroy it. The exotic meats, the peacock problem. Standard fare, beef, pork, was not enough. A feast required spectacle. Swans and peacocks. These birds were roasted, but their real value was visual. After roasting, the cook would skillfully reattach the entire skin and feathers to the cooked bird, making it look alive. The peacock's tail would be fanned out. It would be carried into the hall to gasps of amazement. It tasted, by all accounts, terrible and tough, but you weren't eating the meat, you were eating the symbol. Whale and porpoise. If the castle was near the coast, beached whales were a royal delicacy. Porpoise was considered fish and could be eaten on fast days, making it a high-status Lenten centerpiece. 3. The spice trade, the color and the cost. Food had to be colorful. The primary coloring agent was saffron. Saffron, worth more than its weight in gold, was used to dye food a brilliant yellow, signaling immense wealth. Other spices were used in overwhelming quantities: ginger, cloves, mace, and cinnamon, all imported at great cost from the East. The goal was not a balanced flavor, but a powerful one. The food was drenched in spices to prove the host could afford to do so. 4. The entertainment, the minstrel's fee. A feast was also an entertainment budget. Minstrels and troubadours. These traveling musicians were paid a high fee for a single night's performance, plus room and board. Acrobats, jugglers, and mimes, hired to perform between courses. Heralds. These men were masters of ceremony. Their job was to announce each course with a trumpet flourish and a loud proclamation. Behold, the boar's head! A single feast could consume a month's worth of the castle's normal operating budget. But in the medieval economy, the loyalty, fear, and obligation it purchased were considered a sound investment. Part 20. The Ecclesiastical Economy, the Chapel. We've mentioned the chapel bell as the castle's clock, but the chapel was its own distinct economic entity, often functioning with a budget separate from the stewards. It was the castle's non-profit wing, but it had very real costs and projected very real power. The chaplain, the information officer. The castle chaplain was the priest responsible for the spiritual life of the household, but his real power often came from a simple fact: he could read and write. In a household where the Lord himself might be only semi-literate, the chaplain was the information officer. He read incoming letters to the Lord. He wrote the Lord's replies. He served as the notary, witnessing and sealing charters and contracts. He often taught the Lord's children their basic letters. This gave him immense subtle power. He was the gatekeeper of information. As such, he was paid well, often receiving the tithes, a 10% tax, from a specific village or manor assigned directly to him. The budget of belief. The chapel itself was an economic statement. A poor, drafty chapel suggested a poor, impious lord. A magnificent chapel suggested wealth and divine favor. 1. The wax economy, the light of God. The single greatest expense for any chapel was beeswax candles. Tallow, animal fat, were cheap. They smoked, smelled awful, and guttered. They were fine for the barracks or the stable, but for the altar, for God's service, only pure, white, sweet-smelling beeswax was acceptable. Beeswax was a luxury. It was expensive to harvest and purify. A large castle chapel could burn pounds of beeswax every day. The chapel's accounts show constant, massive purchases of wax, especially before major festivals like Easter or Christmas. This light was quite literally burning money as a sign of devotion. 2. The incense budget, the scent of heaven. As discussed in Filth and Fragrance, incense was a functional item to mask smells. But in the chapel, it was a theological necessity. Frankincense and myrrh, imported from Arabia and Africa, were burned at every Mass. This was another expensive, imported consumable, a direct line item in the chaplain's bucket. 3. The vestment account, the fabric of power. The chaplain's work clothes were vestments. These were not simple robes. They were made of the most expensive materials available to mankind: silk from China, velvet from Italy, and cloth of gold, fabric woven with real gold thread. These vestments were heavily embroidered. They were economic assets. A single cope, a type of cloak, could be worth more than a farmer's entire flock of sheep. They were kept locked in a vestry and recorded in the castle inventory alongside the silver plate and the armor. Giving a fine vestment to a visiting bishop was a major political gift. The economy of salvation, chantries and alms. Finally, the chapel budget included salvation. Chantry. A lord might endow a chantry priest. This was a priest paid an annual salary for one job: to sing Mass every single day for the soul of the Lord and his ancestors forever. This was a perpetual, recurring line item in the castle's long-term budget. Alms. The household was expected to give alms, charity, to the poor. This was often done through the chapel. The almoner was an officer who collected the leftovers from the Great Hall, especially the bread trenchers, and distributed them to the poor at the castle gate. This was not just kindness. It was an economic function. It provided a basic social safety net, ensuring the local poor didn't starve and thus revolt, and it purchased divine favor for the Lord. The chapel, therefore, was not a quiet retreat. It was a busy economic center, consuming wax, incense, silk, and wine, and in return, producing the intangible but essential products of literacy, timekeeping, and salvation. Part 21. The Information Economy, Parchment and Power. We have discussed the chaplain as the literate man of the castle, the keeper of time and information. But this information ran on a physical infrastructure that was itself a complex and expensive economy. Today, information is cheap, data is weightless. In the Middle Ages, information was heavy, expensive, and made from dead animals. The technology of record, parchment. The primary medium for all the accounts we've discussed, the pipe rolls, the household ledgers, the charters, was not paper. Paper existed, arriving from China via the Islamic world, but it was considered flimsy and suspect. The gold standard for any document intended to last was parchment. Parchment is animal skin, usually sheep, goat, or calf, the finest form called vellum. The production of a single sheet was a grueling, disgusting, and highly skilled process. Sourcing. The castle's reeve or steward had to account for the loss of an animal. A sheep wasn't just meat and wool, it was also a potential document. Preparation. The skin was soaked in a caustic lime solution for days to loosen the hair and fat. Scraping. The skin was stretched taut on a wooden frame. A worker, a parchmenter, would use a special curved knife to scrape away every trace of hair and flesh. Stretching and drying. The skin was restretched and allowed to dry under tension, which aligns the fibers of the skin, turning it from leather into parchment. Finishing. The surface was dusted with chalk, pounce, and rubbed smooth with a pumice stone, creating a uniform, pale, and durable writing surface. A single large document, like a map of the manor, might require the skins of several animals. A 200-page book required a small flock. The castle's budget, therefore, had a line item for parchment, which was an expensive artisanal product. Every ledger, every rent roll was a herd of sheep quantified in ink. The cost of ink and illumination. The ink itself was an economic product. The most common ink was iron gall ink. It was made from 4 ingredients. Oak galls, small, hard, woody tumors that grow on oak trees, caused by wasp larvae. These had to be foraged in the woods, a labor cost. Vitriol, iron sulfate, a mineral. Gum arabic, a binder, imported from acacia trees in the Middle East. Water or wine, the solvent. The resulting ink was black, permanent, and acidic. It literally bit into the parchment, making it impossible to erase without leaving a visible scrape. For truly high-status documents, a charter from the king or a personal prayer book for the lady, the budget exploded. This required illumination. Red ink, rubrication, made from minium, red lead, or cinnabar, mercury sulfide, both toxic and expensive minerals. Blue ink, the most expensive color of all. True ultramarine blue was made from ground-up lapis lazuli, a semi-precious stone imported only from a single region in Afghanistan. A small jar of this pigment could cost as much as a suit of armor. Gold leaf. The document would be sized, painted with a sticky glue, like egg white, and then painstakingly overlaid with tissue-thin sheets of beaten gold. The scribe and the scrivener. Finally, there was the human cost. The scribe, or scrivener, was a professional, high-skilled laborer. This was not creative writing, this was data entry. The scribe sat for hours in the cold scriptorium, writing room, hunched over a sloped desk, copying accounts. His tools were a quill pen, which he had to constantly resharpen with a penknife, his pot of ink, and his scraper for correcting errors on the parchment. He was paid by the word or by the page. This was monotonous, physically demanding work. The writer's cramp was real, but he was the castle's hard drive. He was the one who made the tally sticks permanent. The castle's entire economic memory, its wealth, its debts, its power, was not an abstract concept. It was a physical library of expensive animal skins, bound with wood and leather, and covered in acidic, metallic ink, all copied by a paid professional. Part 22. The Justice Economy, Fines, Fees, and Prisons. In Part 9, we discussed the castle court as a legal hub. Now, let us be blunt. The castle court was not just a tool for justice, it was a profit center. For the medieval lord, justice was not a service he provided, it was a right he owned, and he extracted revenue from that right at every possible opportunity. The Catalogue of Fines. The court's primary income was from amercements, what we would call fines, but they weren't just for theft. Harriet. This was the death tax. When a tenant died, his heir had to pay a harriet to the lord, in the castle court, to inherit the land. This was almost always the tenant's best beast, his best ox, or his best cow. This was a massive economic blow to a grieving family, ensuring wealth always flowed back to the lord. Merchant. This was the marriage tax. If a tenant's daughter wished to marry someone from outside the manor, the tenant had to pay the lord a fee. Why? Because the lord was losing a laborer. The woman's productive and reproductive capacity was seen as the lord's asset, and he demanded compensation for its transfer. Lairwhite. A fine levied on a woman, or her father, for becoming pregnant out of wedlock. Again, the economic logic was cold. An illegitimate child had a complex claim on the manor's resources, and the lord extracted a fee for this disruption. Fines for work. Tenants were often required to work on the lord's domain lands for free, called boon work. If a tenant failed to show up, perhaps because his own crops needed harvesting, he was hauled before the court and fined heavily for his absence. Market fines. As discussed, the court fined bakers for light bread and brewers for weak ale. They also fined anyone caught using false measures, e.g., a rigged scale. The prisoner economy, paying for your own chains. What happened if you couldn't pay your fine? You were sent to the castle's dungeon or jail. Here, a new and terrifying economy began. A medieval jail was not a state-run facility. It was a private enterprise run by the jailer. The jailer, or constable, often received no salary for this job. He made his money from the prisoners. Entry fee. A prisoner had to pay to be admitted. Easement fees. A prisoner had to pay for easement, comfort. Want bread? Pay the jailer. Want water? Pay the jailer. Want a blanket? Pay the jailer. Want to be in the upper prison with a window instead of the wet, lightless dungeon? Pay the jailer. Iron fees. The prisoner had to pay for the very manacles and chains that bound him. Exit fee. If a prisoner was found innocent or his family paid his fine, he was still not free. He had to pay a release fee to the jailer to be let out the door. This system was brutal. A prisoner with no money would literally starve to death in the dark unless his family brought him food, which the jailer might also charge a fee for allowing. The jail was the ultimate predator, extracting the last few pennies from those who had nothing. The executioner's wage. And what of the ultimate penalty? An execution was also an economic event. The executioner was not a full-time staff member. He was a specialist, often a social outcast, who was paid by the job. The castle accounts would show a payment to this individual for his work. This fee varied based on the method of execution. Hanging. This was the cheapest, most common method for a common criminal. Beheading. This was seen as a more noble death, reserved for high-status criminals. It required a skilled executioner, using a sword, not an axe in many places, and thus commanded a higher fee. Boiling alive. This horrific but rare execution was reserved for coiners, people who counterfeited money. By destroying the lord's economic authority, they were given the most expensive and agonizing death. Thus, from a simple fine for weak ale to a beheading on the scaffold, the castle's justice system was a finely tuned machine for extracting revenue. Part 23. The military sub-economies, armory and stable. We have discussed the castle's purpose as a military fortress, but we have not truly detailed the staggering cost of the hardware required, the armor, the weapons, and the horses. This was the Formula One of the medieval economy. 1. The armory economy. The castle's armorer was, along with the master mason, one of the most skilled and highest-paid craftsmen in the realm. His workshop, the armory, was a specialized forge, part factory, part research lab. The cost of mail. Before the 15th century, the primary body armor was mail, often miscalled chainmail. This was not a simple metal shirt. A single hauberk, mail shirt, was made of 10,000 to 30,000 individual iron rings. Each ring had to be formed from iron wire, interlinked with 4 other rings, riveted shut one by one. This was an insanely labor-intensive process. A single mail shirt could take a skilled craftsman months to produce. Its cost was equivalent to a small farm. A lord's accounts would list these shirts as individual high-value assets to be passed down or recovered from the dead. The rise of plate, the arms race. As crossbows and longbows became more powerful, mail was no longer enough. This led to the rise of plate armor. This was even more expensive. It required specialized steel, not just iron, but high-carbon steel that could be hardened. Master craftsmen, men who were part blacksmith, part sculptor. They had to shape the steel perfectly to the human form. A poorly fitted joint meant a dead knight. specialized workshops, water-powered hammers, precision tools. A full suit of Gothic plate armor in the 15th century was the equivalent of a supercar. Its cost was astronomical, affordable only by the wealthiest knights and lords. A castle's armory was responsible for maintaining these supercars, polishing them to prevent rust, replacing rivets, and repairing dents. Weapons, arrows versus swords. Swords. A sword was a high-status sidearm. A well-balanced, high-carbon steel sword was expensive, a gentleman's weapon. Arrows. This was the real cost of war. An English longbowman could fire 10 to 12 arrows per minute. An army of 5,000 archers could fire 60,000 arrows a minute. This required a massive, non-stop supply chain. Bodkins, arrowheads, had to be forged by blacksmiths in the thousands. Shafts had to be cut from specific wood, like ash, straightened, seasoned for months, and fletched with goose feathers, requiring massive goose farms. Bowstrings, made of hemp or sinew, snapped and had to be constantly replaced. The fletcher, bowyer, and arrowsmith were permanent, essential parts of the castle's military-industrial complex. 2. The stable economy, the destrier. The marshal's domain, the stable, was not just a barn. It was the castle's motor pool, and it housed a vehicle more valuable than any other, the destrier, or warhorse. A horse is not a horse. The medieval world had many horses, and they were priced like cars. The pack horse, Rouncy, a cheap, slow-moving horse for carrying baggage, the Ford Fiesta of its day. The palfrey, a smooth-gaited, comfortable horse for riding long distances, the Mercedes S-Class for the lord and lady. The destrier, the warhorse. This was a massive, powerful stallion, bred not for comfort, but for power and aggression. This was a main battle tank. The cost of the destrier. A single, high-quality destrier could cost 80 to 100 pounds. To put that in perspective, a common laborer earned 1 to 2 pence a day. A skilled mason earned 6 pence a day. It would take a skilled mason over 10 years to earn enough to buy one warhorse. Why so expensive? Breeding. They were rare, specialized, and took years to train. Feeding. A destrier was a muscle machine. It couldn't just eat grass. It required a high-energy diet of oats and high-quality hay, the same food humans ate, grain. It consumed a massive portion of the castle's agricultural output. Armor. The horse also needed armor, barding, which was another massive expense from the armorer. A knight riding into battle on a fully armored destrier was the economic equivalent of a modern man driving a Bugatti into battle. The cost was breathtaking. The castle's stable accounts, the meticulous records of hay, oats, straw, and blacksmithing fees for horseshoes, were not a minor detail. They were the fuel bill for the entire military machine. Part 24. The urban economy, the borough. The castle, as we've established, was not an island. In fact, its entire economic model was designed to prevent it from being an island. While the domain lands and manorial farms provided sustenance, food, wool, timber, the castle's primary source of liquid cash, the silver coins needed to pay soldiers and buy luxury goods like wine and spices, came from its symbiotic partner, the town. Many of the most successful castles were built with a borough, a chartered town, deliberately planted right outside their gates. This was a calculated act of economic engineering. The symbiotic contract. The bargain was simple. The castle provides security. The shadow of the walls offered protection from bandits, raiders, and rival lords. This security was the single most valuable commodity a merchant could ask for. The town provides cash. The town was a concentration of non-agricultural specialists, merchants, craftsmen, and artisans who did not pay their rent in labor, but in silver coin. This relationship was formalized in a borough charter. The lord would grant the town's citizens, the burgesses, specific, valuable privileges. Freedom. They were not serfs, tied to the land. They were freemen. Market rights. The right to hold a weekly market and an annual fair. Burgage plots. Land in the town held for a fixed, low annual money rent, not labor service. Borough court. The right to handle their own minor legal disputes, like debts between merchants, in their own court rather than the lord's manorial court. The town as a cash register. For the lord, this charter was not an act of kindness, it was a business plan. Every single privilege generated cash for the castle's treasury. The market tolls. Every merchant who was not a citizen of the town had to pay a toll to set up a stall in the marketplace. The lord's reeve walked the market daily, collecting these fees. The pickage and stallage. Fees paid for the right to break ground, pickage, to set up a tent pole, and the rent for the market space itself, stallage. The bridge toll, pontage. As we mentioned, castles were often built at choke points. The town's market drew merchants, and those merchants had to cross the Lord's bridge, paying a toll for every cart. The assize of bread and ale. The castle court not only fined its own bakers, but also the town's bakers, ensuring quality and generating a steady stream of fines. The guild economy, organized monopoly. As these towns grew, the craftsmen themselves organized into guilds. The guilds of weavers, bakers, blacksmiths, masons were another form of economic control, often sanctioned by the lord. A guild was a monopoly. It controlled quality. The guild set the standards for a product. A masterpiece was required for a craftsman to become a master. It controlled price. The guild fixed prices, preventing ruinous competition. It controlled labor. It set the terms for apprenticeship, often 7 years, ensuring that new workers entered the market slowly, keeping wages high for existing members. How did the lord profit? He taxed the guild. The guilds would pay the lord an annual fee, a firma, for the right to have their monopoly. The town, therefore, was the castle's venture capital project. The lord invested security, and in return, he created a dense, taxable hub of specialized labor and commerce that generated the silver he needed to pay for his wars, his wine, and his walls. Part 25. The Credit Economy, the Moneylenders. We have built a picture of a vast, complex economy, but we have overlooked one fundamental problem: cash flow. A lord's wealth was in land. His income, grain, wool, rent, came in slowly at harvest time. But his expenses, war, a royal marriage, a new castle, were immediate and massive. What did a lord do when he needed a colossal sum of silver right now? He couldn't wait for the harvest. He had to borrow. This created a parallel high-stakes economy of credit, often run by groups who were outside the normal feudal structure. The Christian sin of usury. The medieval church had a strict ban on usury, the lending of money at interest. This was considered a mortal sin. A Christian knight or lord could not, in theory, lend money to a fellow Christian and charge interest. This created an economic vacuum. The demand for credit was enormous from kings, popes, and lords, but the legal supply was almost zero. This vacuum was filled by two groups. One, the Italian bankers, the super guilds. In the 13th century, merchant banking families from the Florence, Siena, and Lucca, like the Bardi, Peruzzi, and Riccardi, became the bankers to kings. How did they get around the sin of usury? The fee loophole. They didn't charge interest, they charged fees for damages incurred by the loan, the risk, the cost of transport, the loss of not being able to use that money elsewhere. The exchange rate loophole. They would lend money in one currency, e.g. Florentine florins, to be repaid in another, e.g. English pound sterling, at a future date. The exchange rate they set for that future payment had the interest payment cleverly built into it. These bankers became unimaginably powerful. When Edward I built his Welsh castles, he was running on cash advanced by the Riccardi banking house of Lucca. He was, in essence, building his empire on a medieval credit card. This power was also their doom. In the 14th century, when Edward III defaulted on his massive war loans to the Bardi and Peruzzi families to pay for the 100 Years' War, the banks collapsed, triggering a massive financial crisis in Florence. 2. The Jewish moneylenders, the local lenders. While Italians handled macro loans to kings, the micro loans to local knights and minor barons were often handled by the Jewish community. Why? Because the sin of usury was interpreted as a sin between Christians. Jewish law, which also forbids usury, was interpreted to allow lending to non-Jews. They were, therefore, one of the few groups legally able to fill the vital economic niche of providing local credit. This placed them in a position of immense importance and immense danger. The economic function. A knight needed a new warhorse. He went to the Jewish moneylender, using his land's future rent as collateral. The royal asset. The king saw the Jewish community as his property. He protected them, in theory, because they were, in essence, his personal financial resource. He allowed them to lend money and become wealthy, and then he would tax them at extortionate rates, effectively using them as a sponge to gather the kingdom's liquid wealth into his own hands. The tragic end. This protection was fickle. When the king, like Edward I in 1290, was in deep financial trouble and could no longer tax his lords, he played a populist card. He canceled his own massive debts to the Jewish lenders and then expelled the entire community from England, seizing all their remaining assets and loan books. The castle's credit economy was a story of grim necessity. The great stone walls we see were often built on a foundation of invisible, complex, and deeply cynical financial instruments, loans that skirted religious law and were secured by the power of the king. Part 26. The Decline. The Long Sunset. The economic system of the medieval castle, this intricate machine of manors, guilds, courts, and armies, seemed permanent for centuries. But by the late Middle Ages, 1400 to 1500s, it was collapsing. It was not one thing that killed it. It was a perfect storm of 3 economic shocks, each one striking at a different pillar of the castle's power. Shock 1. The biological shock, the Black Death. In 1348, the bubonic plague, the Black Death, arrived in Europe. It killed, in some regions, between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire population. This was, first, a human tragedy, but it was, second, the greatest economic event of the millennium. The pillar attacked, feudal labor. How it worked. The entire castle economy was built on a surplus of cheap peasant labor. Tenants worked the lord's land for low wages or in exchange for their own small plots. The shock. Suddenly, labor was scarce. There were not enough people to harvest the grain, mill the flour, or shear the sheep. The result, the peasants' revolt. For the first time, the surviving peasants had leverage. They could demand real wages in cash. They could leave a lord who treated them poorly and find another who would pay more. The old system of boon work and serfdom collapsed. The castle's budget. The lord's primary source of profit, free or cheap labor, vanished. His wage bill for everything, farmhands, servants, masons, exploded. Shock 2. The technological shock, gunpowder. As we discussed in Barut Mahasabesi, gunpowder changed everything. The pillar attacked, military dominance, the stone wall. How it worked. A castle's military and economic power came from its impenetrability. It was a secure base. The shock. By the mid-15th century, new powerful siege cannons, like the bombards used by the Ottomans to take Constantinople, could turn a 10-foot thick stone wall into rubble in a matter of days, not months. The result, the arms race. The only defense against a cannon was a new kind of fortress, one with low, thick, angled bastions, the tres italienne, designed to deflect cannonballs. These new fortresses were 100 times more expensive than the old castles. The castle's budget. The local lord was priced out. He could not afford to build a new cannon-proof fort. Only the king, with the tax revenue of an entire nation, could. The castle became militarily obsolete. Shock 3. The political shock. The rise of the state. This was the final nail in the coffin. The pillar attacked. Local authority. The lord's power. How it worked. The castle was the caput, the head of all local justice, finance, and military power. The shock. Kings, flush with new tax money and gunpowder weapons, no longer needed to ask their feudal lords to bring knights to a war. They could hire their own standing army, a permanent, professional army paid in cash. The result, centralization. The king now had the only real army. He also began to centralize the justice system, sending his own royal judges on circuits, bypassing the local castle courts. The castle's budget. The castle lost its 2 main reasons for existing. It was no longer the primary military base, the king's army was, and it was no longer the primary justice hub, the king's court was. It was just a very large, very cold, very expensive house. By 1600, the economic model of the medieval castle was dead. It was a high-maintenance, low-revenue asset that couldn't defend itself and had lost its political function. Epilogue: The Clerks Who Kept the Walls Standing. Let me leave you with one final image. It's a winter afternoon in 1286. Outside, snow is falling on the Welsh hills. Inside a castle's counting room, a clerk named William sits at a table. He's wearing a threadbare cloak and fingerless gloves. His hands are ink-stained. In front of him are tally sticks, pieces of wood notched to record debts and payments. To his right is a parchment roll, columns ruled in thin lines. He is reconciling the week's expenses: 2 cartloads of lime, delivered but not yet paid for, wages for 6 masons, 3 carpenters, 2 hodmen, a barrel of nails purchased from a traveling merchant, firewood consumed by the garrison, bread distributed to workers. William does this every week. He will do it next week and the week after. No one will remember his name. No chronicle will mention him. But without William and thousands like him, the castle would collapse, not from siege, but from mismanagement. The clerks kept the walls standing as much as the masons did. They turned the chaotic flow of materials, labor, and money into comprehensible order. They made it possible to plan, to budget, to endure. When you look at a medieval castle, you're looking at William's work as much as at the masons. The stone is visible, the accounting is invisible, but both were equally essential. That's the final truth of castle economics. Power wasn't just built in stone, it was built in ledgers, maintained in accounts, and sustained by the unglamorous work of people whose names we'll never know, counting coins by candlelight while snow fell outside. The walls we admire today stand because someone, somewhere, paid attention to the receipts.